I don't know, Rabbi Ern, about your year in rabbinical school, but I remember very, very clearly that in my senior year of rabbinical school, as they were starting to hand out senior sermon assignments, right? This week's Parsha, or this week's and next week's combined, was the one that nobody wanted to get.
Rabbi Kornberg, as the few of you here that came last night learned, I was assigned this week's
I
Torah.
know you were.
Okay, fine, yeah.
That's why I'm giving you props. I should, if you want, let's have Rabbi Ern come up and give his senior sermon. I think that'd be, no. So Tazria is in the middle of the book of Vayikra. And it speaks this week and next week. We speak about different skin ailments, skin diseases, and most specifically something called Mitzora, which is translated most often as leprosy, although there's some scholarly debate whether or not it truly is the leprosy that we know from the Middle Ages as leprosy, or whether or not it was another skin disease. I'll leave that for the scholars and physicians to argue. But it was highly contagious. It was actually contagious not just for people, but actually for things. Things could get Mitzora. That's why they're saying it may not be leprosy, it may be something else. And it created a challenge for the community. Because on the one hand, community is all about bringing everybody together. And yet, on the other hand, this required this person to be on the outside for the safety of the rest of the community, right? You don't want somebody that has a communicable disease to actually be in contact with other people. You want to try and limit and isolate that. And so this week's Torah portion and next week's Torah portion speaks about that and speaks about both the permanent Mitzora, right? Something in which case you are going to now be on the outside of the community forever, and the transient Mitzora, right? The temporary one where a priest, you can come back, a Kohen can look at you, can diagnose that it is now better, and you can come back into the community. I'm going to leave the rabbinic interpretation for now of why Mitzora comes. I may talk about that next week in terms of the idea of Lashon Hara, the idea of it is the result of somebody speaking negatively or spreading rumors about people, and this is where it comes from. That's the rabbinic interpretation of it. I actually want to talk about something completely different, in that if we look at the very beginning of this week's Parsha, other than focusing on the Mitzora, there's really only one commandment that is mentioned. And that is the commandment of circumcision. So in this week's Parsha, we have this strange bringing together of the rules of the Mitzora, the rules of the person who has this skin ailment, and circumcision. The question is why? I want us to sort of think a little bit. Why might these two ideas be brought together in the same Torah portion? Bruce. So one option, I think it's a very reasonable way to look at it, is they're both medically related, right? They both are, in some ways, they require somebody with expertise, with some sort of medical expertise, whether it's a mohel, whether it's somebody who can do the circumcision, or whether it's the Kohen who can diagnose, treat, and understand the Mitzora, right? Okay, so they both require some sort of medical proficiency.
One is a mitzvah commandment that unites us and brings us together. Another is a, whatever, disease, a sign of unholiness, whatever, that causes people to be outside the king.
Excellent, excellent. I actually really lean into this idea that Mitzora is all about the moments when we need to pull somebody or bring somebody out of community. And therefore, let's talk about Brit Milah, which at least for males is the moment that we bring somebody into community, right? And they are both medical. They're through the physical body as opposed to through any spiritual aspect, right? That I think is a big part of this. Yeah, Diana.
I think also both involve a little bit of a waiting period because you're diagnosed with the Matzara, and they go through this whole thing, and you isolate, but then you do end up coming back. So you have this period where you're out, but the goal is to bring you back in after you've been checked out and you're okay with Brit Milah as well.
I like that, Diana. I actually didn't think about that. It's not something that I had thought about, but I really, really like that. There's a whole sermon coming up in my head as I'm thinking about that. But this idea of it's not neither of these things are sort of an instant gratification moment, right? Yeah, we talked about Savlanut in my Midot class this last week about patience. Both of them require us to take a breather, right? For as much as, young parents who have a baby boy, want to bring them into the community right away, maybe not have a bris right away, right? But bring that baby into the community right away, we have to wait 8 days.
But also you have to make sure that they're healthy because
Agreed.
if the baby has jaundice or something, it's the same thing. You wait, and when they're healthy, they're strong enough, then okay.
Agreed. You may have to wait even longer than 8 days, right? If your child has an ailment of some sort that would delay the bris, but minimally everybody has to wait 8 days. You can't do it any earlier. And by the same token, there is, I'm really liking this. There is the requirement, right? Even though I want to get back into community, I have this ailment, I need to wait. I have to have that patience because the community isn't ready for me, right? The community isn't ready for me. All right, well, maybe next year, look for that first sermon for next year. Josh. I'm sorry, Jeff. Wow, I keep calling you Josh. Jeff.
Is this God's way of looking at the golden rule of do unto yourself as you want to do, or do unto others as you want to do on yourself? If the leprosy and the Matzora is due because you did lashon hara, something bad, you have to be punished and you are taken out. But a woman going through all the risks in the biblical time of childbirth, which is not like childbirth right now,
Agreed.
pretty much potentially sacrificing themselves for someone else, that they should be brought into the community. So this is to look at the golden rule.
It's interesting. I like that, right? If we go into the rabbinic interpretation that the reason that someone is afflicted with Mitzora is because of Lashon Hara, because of evil speech about somebody else, in essence, they are trying to ostracize that person from the community. That's what Lashon Hara does, right? It isolates and ostracizes that person that you're speaking negatively about, and therefore the punishment for that is you yourself are now ostracized from the community. On the other hand, or the other side of it, is for a woman who is going through the risks of childbirth at that time, and it was, much more dangerous than it is today, although obviously people still did it. It is to bring that person, the end result is to bring that person into the community, to welcome them in, to say almost thank you for that risk that you took to bring another Jewish child into the community. Okay? Anybody else? Why might circumcision be connected or set in this week's Parsha? So Nechama Leibovitz, in her studies on Vayikra, actually highlights a commentary called the Akedat Yitzchak. And they bring 6 different reasons. The Akedat Yitzchak brings 6 different reasons why circumcision may be connected here, or why it's so important. The last, actually, interestingly enough, I'll start with the last, is the Akedat Yitzchak writes, the 6th reason concerns the spirit in which the precept is fulfilled. Beyond the other benefits is the fact that it's performed at God's behest and not out of any rational considerations, right? There's no rational reason for circumcision. There is a highly rational reason to take somebody who has Mitzorah and move them away from everybody else so that that disease is not caught by anybody else. And so perhaps it's again showing the 2 different poles, 2 different sides of what we do, right? There are things that we do because it makes sense, right? And there are things that we do because that's who we are. And that's what God told us to do. And I would argue that circumcision is absolutely one of those things, especially in today's day and age. Today's day and age, where there's a much stronger push against circumcision in our culture, in American culture, than we've seen in other times, right? To be able to say, no, I as a Jew am going to do this because I'm a Jew, because this is what we do. And yes, I understand you can tell me that medically there's no benefit and all of these sorts of things, but that's not why I do it. That's a much more difficult place to be as a Jew. And yet, to some degree, that's what all of these mitzvot in Vayikra are focusing us on, especially since there are many of them that we don't do in the same way. We've just had a couple of weeks talking about sacrifices. We don't do that anymore. It isn't until we get to Parashat Kedoshim that we start to, this we can understand. You shall be holy, for I am holy, and how we treat the stranger. And yes, that's who we are as Jews, no doubt. But it's harder to connect to what's going on in this Parsha. And I would argue that by putting circumcision here as a counterpoint to Tazria, it's actually rounding out who we are as Jews. It's saying, well, it's not just about medical necessity. It's not just about the needs of the community. And by the way, the easiest thing to do would be for the community to say, even if you have transient Mitzorah, right, one that's going to be temporary, to say, once you have Mitzorah, you're out. And most communities did that, right? If it is leprosy, right? Those are the leper colonies. They didn't mess around with that. They realized how communicable it was, and they didn't ask, is this a temporary one? Is this a permanent one? You're out. But we as Jews say, wait a second. If there's a need, yes, you're going to be out. But as soon as we can bring you back into the community, we're going to do that. And on the other side, we've got this ritual of circumcision that nobody else was doing. There's no rational need or medical need for it, and yet we do that because that's what it means to be Jewish. And both of these are brought in this Parsha of Tazria. Any comments, any thoughts on that? Any other example other than these two that might work in that same way for us as Jews? Kind of the rational versus the spiritual.
Would you say kashrut?
Well, kashrut's an interesting conversation. Kashrut is an interesting conversation, Marge. There are a lot of people that actually try to make an argument for kashrut from a rational health side of things, right? To say, yes, well, we don't eat pork or shellfish because, pork, if you don't cook it properly, you can get trichinosis. Shellfish, we have those red tides, and you can get sick from that. Therefore, we stick to things that are, health-based. Hold on, I'll get to shotness in a second. But if health was really the predominant motivator for kashrut, I guarantee you we wouldn't still be salting our meat. Right? I mean, we now have, we know that that's not the major motivating factor here, right? And for those who have been in my basic Judaism class, when we get to kashrut, we talk specifically about the fact that kashrut is not about health, it's about holiness, right? It's about making choices and decisions about what you eat. So I would actually say yes to you, although people try to argue kashrut from a health side, it's actually the opposite. It's actually one of those things that we look and we say, why are we doing this? Oh, we're doing this because it's what it means to be Jewish. Okay. Right? There's no health reason to not have dairy and meat together. There's a lot of moral reasons if you think about dairy as a symbol of life and meat as death, and to say, why should we be so callous to mix those as if they don't matter? Okay, that's a spiritual, rich, understanding of it. But it's not a medical or a health sort of thing. Diana mentioned shotness. Shotness is sort of the classic law, or the classic example of a law that has no rhyme or reason other than we were just told not to. Now, I remember, for those who remember Albert, who used to be here as part of our congregation, Albert and I got into a conversation once, and he thought he figured out a logical reason why you don't mix wool and linen together. And he had this whole long explanation about how they when you wash them, they actually shrink at different rates. And the reality is, our tradition says, just do it, right? Our tradition says, just do it. We have those moments. And so I think it's powerful to have a just do it, a reminder of the just do it, in a parasha that is all about practicality, at least at the outset. I've given sermons on this parasha also, and when we speak probably next week about, Mitzorah as coming from Lashon Hara, there is a spiritual aspect to it as well. But looking at the surface as the pshat of this is about keeping the community safe. And it's about making sure that once the community is safe and a person is able to come back, we bring them back in as soon as we can, but we have to keep the community safe. And at the same time, we're reminded of this other piece of it. All right, any last-minute comments or questions before we get into all of the, shall I say, gory details of leprosy and its treatment? All right. Shabbat shalom, everyone.